Hey, big family. I'm Pamela Bailey, and welcome to this episode of The Longer I Live. And so I want to introduce you to someone who's really pretty special. Years ago, when I started and developed my own project, which is the Antebellum Diaspora Project, and that's where I'm finding my own family that was separated by slavery in the antebellum South, I knew that I was going to have to travel back to South Carolina to do some research. Primarily, I was looking in the PD region, but I also know that my family has a history in the Low Country. So I was speaking and working with several genealogists, and several of them kept giving me this gentleman's name. And they said to me, you have to talk to Grant Mishoe. You've got to talk to Grant Mishoe. And so I have with me today Grant Mishoe. Welcome,
Mhm.
Grant.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine. I am so glad that you were able to take time to be with me today. And you do so many things, but I want my audience to get to know you a little bit better. And so I'm just going to ask you just to tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into genealogy.
Well, thank you, ma'am. I'm retired from the fire department originally. Did 20 plus years with the North Charleston Fire Department as a heavy rescue captain. Um, the my family's been in this area for quite a while. We'll talk about that. Um, I got involved in genealogy through my stepmother because she was adopted. So as I went on, because I got a master's degree in the School of Hard Knocks, I did everything, trial and error. And you quickly learn there's two kinds of people in genealogy. One is they can care less where your family comes from, and the other one, they'll never find the bottom of a rabbit hole. They just keep digging and digging, digging. And I'm on the
Mhm.
latter. Um, the I'm a lifelong resident of Charleston, South Carolina. um, And me and my stepmother, we still collaborate to this day on things. We find out something new all the time in our family. And I keep working with some people on the side, doing some things now. But yeah, basically I've been here for 55 years.
Okay. Now, your last name, I believe, it sounds French, maybe
It
French
is,
Huguenot.
yes, ma'am, it is Huguenot. The um, the last name is original pronunciation was Michaud.
Mhm.
It was Michau or Aud. Um, I had the anglicized version, which is Mishoe, but there's about 14 derivatives of that last name. My family came here in 1697. That was 9 generations ago. They've came here to Charleston, then they went up just up the road to Jamestown, and they've been in this and then to Horry County and back down again. So they've all been along the coast the whole time, right here, within 100 miles. Um, and that's covered the Indian Wars, the Civil War, I mean, the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, the Civil War, Spanish American War, World War One, World War Two, Vietnam. So yeah, a lot of Michos were at the footsteps of a lot of these historical changing events that happened in the world.
So you have a very rich family history, and one of the things that I think is so beautiful about some of the things that you do, particularly within the African American community research, because a lot of us don't have as much history as you would have, going back to 1600. There's several of us who've been able to find our families way back, but a lot of people have not. They hit that 1870 brick wall. But I want to find out how specifically you became interested in African American genealogy research and cemetery graveyard preservation.
Well, eventually, originally, I started with burial grounds. I found an
Mhm.
old burial ground out in the middle of the woods hunting one day, and this is pre-Google. So it took me a while to find some information out about people in there. And then later on, I learned that it was a previously enslaved cemetery that continued to be used. And that cemetery is now gone through development. It was destroyed. And I made it my mission to be a burr in the sides of developers, saving these cemeteries. And it's been a trip. And, just when you say, I've seen everything when it comes to these things, God likes to throw you a curveball and you see something even more horrible, that type
Mhm.
thing. Um, and I'd love to ask him, I said, what if it's your grandmother's grave? What if it's your family's grave?
Mhm.
But, money stands in front of a lot of that, but with the
It
way
does.
history is being approached now,
Mhm. Mhm.
I've tried to explain it would be beneficial for you to embrace the burial ground within a development because then you get the people that in the community that are on your side. You're doing a little bit of redesign or cleaning this thing up, and a lot of people move into these neighborhoods. People still think it's detrimental to have a burial ground in a neighborhood, but you're moving into the South, which is historical to begin with. you
Right.
know
And it's interesting because in the South and even in other countries, how we see cemeteries and burial grounds is very different. And I'm going to ask you about the difference in those two things. It seems very simple to some people, but some people may not know. But before we do that, I want to ask you a little bit more about your family. Now, do I understand that your families, your Michos, were also enslavers?
yes, very much so.
Mhm.
As I did more research on the family and connected dots, and Um, never could find any records, and then you always hold out hope. Yay, maybe they didn't do it. Yay, and then you start finding records with their signatures
Mhm.
on them where they purchased,
Mhm.
and like the first four generations, 5 generations
Mhm.
were enslavers. It's kind of a sledgehammer to the back of the head. It's like, oh my
Mhm.
God, they
Mhm.
took part in this,
Right.
and we do have in our family we do have the section that's black Michos, and we're connected through my fourth great grandfather, and they live in Horry County in Bucksport. And it's not as rare as people think it is that the people that were previously enslaved would take the master's last name or whoever owned them the last name because for the majority of the time it's pretty much out of you know convenience because they had been using it.
Okay, let me just ask this question, and
Sure.
it may not seem important to some people, but I think it is important to talk about this because in the projects on the projects that I'm working on, my antebellum diaspora project as well as my documentary project, I have been very, very, I don't know if I lucky, but I would probably say blessed that I have found people on the other side of this history where your family is, as opposed to where my family would land who've been very cooperative, who've been very helpful in sort of helping me to be able to put together or reunite families that their families had a hand in separating. Some people won't participate and they say things like, those of you who do, that is out of guilt as opposed to just being responsible. And so I get the feeling from our first conversation that we had, when I was in Charleston last year, is that a lot of what you do is just out of responsibility,
Right.
for this history. Can you talk a little bit about that, in a way that might even encourage those who may have records or who may have information that could be helpful to families like mine?
I can best sum this up in one incident that occurred with me. I was working on a cemetery in the Monrovia Street. It was Zion Olivet Presbyterian Cemetery, and there's about 55,000 square feet of jungle. I mean, it's nasty. And they had a company clearing the thing out, and I was literally on the ground unearthing a gravestone that had fallen over. I tripped over the corner of it, just sticking out the ground, so I was cleaning the thing out. And my boss at the time, Dr. Adeo Funyan, he had brought some people up to possible donation, that type of thing. Wanted to show what we were doing. And the lady, of the couple, basically, after a few minutes, looked at me and asked me, said, "Why are you so interested in working on colored cemeteries?" So Dr. O tapped me with his foot. I'm laying on the ground now. And Dr. O tapped me on his foot and said, don't, no, no. And you see, he knew that I wasn't going to keep quiet about it. But I said, "Ma'am, you see the gravestones over there that are cemented into the wall of the on-ramp for the interstate." She said, "Yeah, I see that." I said, "You didn't see him build that interstate through your ancestors' graves in Magnolia, now did you?"
Mm.
And it was the beeping and backing up and everything like this. And I quickly told her, I said, "The reason why I do this is because my family owned slaves. They broke families up. And my responsibility doing my family's penance is reacquaint those descendants with those ancestors in the best way I know how to do it. And this is the way I know how to do it.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And so the kind of genealogy that you're talking about is forensic genealogy. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, ma'am. We call it forensic. There's a group of us that call it forensic genealogy because when you look through the different genealogy websites and that type thing, people repeat other people's garbage, that type thing. Information's wrong, just because I see a name and they put the stuff in there. So when people, come to me and so I got all this information right here, and I look at it, I have to deconstruct the stuff
Hmm.
that's been done. And, if there's a possibility of one of those things possibly fitting, I have to basically try to challenge it to find, double information sources or whatever. I don't ever go on a single source if it's sketchy without indicating that there's a possibility this may not be it, you know,
Hmm.
because, you get one generation wrong, everything after that's wrong. And so I spend a lot of my time deconstructing other people's work, and it may be right, but if there's only one source or a questionable source, I have to deconstruct that and try to verify that through other means. And if I can't, I indicate that it's this is a possibility, but may not be.
Hmm. Okay. And so that's really important because being able to do things digitally online has its pros and its
Very
cons.
much so.
Because someone like yourself, you are able to understand the various nuances on records and what they mean. And but there are people who are sort of just learning genealogy or relatively new to it, and they take a name that's similar to, a name of an ancestor, and they just, will copy. I see a lot of copy and paste into records. So usually
Yes.
when I see someone who has just opened an account, on one of these genealogy websites, but they've got 10,000 names, in their trees. For me, that's a good indicator. Now, I do know people personally in my family who have been doing this for years and years, and they legitimately have thousands and thousands of names, but you will see also that their trees have been active for 10 or more years.
Right.
So, it's like it's a blessing or it's a curse. So, what would you advise someone who is just getting to understand how, this online genealogy research works when it comes to getting information off of other people's trees?
You I'll just tell you straight off the bat. First thing you'll look at is the name. If it's an unusual name, there's a pretty good chance you'll be able to find some information on it.
Hmm.
Like I did a tree for one guy. His name was Aloysius Whitaker the Fifth. So I was able to find the first four generations pretty quickly. But if
Pretty
your
quickly.
grandfather's named Bob Smith or Billy Cooper, hold on
Hmm.
for the ride because it's going to be a
Hmm.
long, because there's it's so many people have commonly the same name. And it's just, and some people, they look the first time it pops up, oh, that's it, and that's not it, you
Hmm.
know. Um, so yeah, just that in itself, um, the phonetical spelling of names. Like we have the Manigault family, which is a Huguenot family originally, Manigault around here. But we literally have an African American family that's Manigo. I mean,
Hmm.
that's about as phonetical as you can get. And a lot of the versions of my last name are phonetical spellings,
Hmm.
and that goes on both sides because, education per se wasn't exactly the high on a lot of people's Christmas list back in the day. They were hardworking farmers and stuff, but they couldn't read or write. And
Hmm.
if you, especially when it comes to African Americans, and when it comes to when they were in joined the United States Colored Troops, you have a lot of these Gullah accents that come up with this thing, and they say, well, let's see what it sounds like, that type thing.
Hmm.
Um, So it comes down to basically trial and error. Just trying to vet out the stuff that's not right,
Hmm.
and then try to get stuff that is right. Like if I'm looking for somebody, I do burial lists for cemeteries through death records. Um, I'll find the kids or I find a child, but it doesn't list where he was buried or list he was, which was really, I don't know, say popular here, but for when you have a white death, it lists the burial ground. But if it's a black death in the country, they just list John's Island, James Island, St. Andrew's Parish. They won't tell you the exact burial ground.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
so if you got a question about one of these people, um, the first thing you go look at is his wife. Find out where his wife's buried. There's a good indication that he might be buried there, not necessarily. But then if you look at his children and backtrack through his children, find out if his children are buried there. There's a pretty good indication he might be buried there, but not necessarily so. It is all be a question mark on that. Unless you go there and you happen to find a gravestone knocked over or something like that, it indicates he was buried there. Or if the family has a family Bible that says he's buried there, then that's a direct source from the family. I'll go with that and indicate it came from the family Bible, which leaves a little bit of a question. Well, we don't have exact paperwork, but the family Bible says this.
Okay, okay. And so that's very important to talk about too, is that for a lot of African American families, because a lot of our information was not being recorded outside of census records, that family Bible was pretty important because
Absolutely.
lots of dates for deaths and births and baptismals and things like that. So how would you, or would you suggest that people who are looking, African Americans in particular, who are looking for more information about their families to use those old family Bibles as a resource?
Absolutely. If they have them, yes, absolutely. Another good thing is multiple states now are putting family Bibles digitized on their archive sites. South Carolina's got one, and you may or may not have family in that. I had a friend of mine, his father had gotten a Bible from his father, who was part of the crews that were knocking down the houses for the crosstown in downtown Charleston. And they had found a Bible in the wall of one of these houses. And it's like a big, thick Bible with gold gilt edges and the onion paper
Mhm.
between the prints and everything, leather tooled. And it was the black family named Brown. And in there it had births and deaths. And even when the earthquake of 1886 occurred, they were literally writing in the book and it was shaky. When the earthquake was
Wow.
actually going on.
Well, that's a
Um,
gold mine. That's a
Oh,
gold mine right
absolutely.
there.
But
Yeah.
even then, when I start backtracking the family, a lot of the families from the islands, so you had green, brown, blue, as last names,
Hmm.
and because they would use lots of times they would use colors of the earth as names, and tracking this thing, come to find out that one of these lines actually goes through a fellow named Blue, who was Darius Rucker's father.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay. You mean the singer with Honey
yes,
in the
the
Blowfish?
gospel singer, yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay.
And but it was through his mother's line, but it indicated she was married to this guy here. And I saw Rucker, and I'm like, I knew his mom was buried in Christmas Cemetery in out in Ravenel.
Hmm.
And I started doing some checking, and sure enough, that was who it was. I was like, wow, I would love to. I don't know how to do it, but I'd love to get to talk to him and say, hey, this Bible, is part of your family, that type thing. And
Yeah.
it's still, in fact, some of the people, a dear friend of mine, Tony Carrier, was so taken back by it. She actually got me one of these acid-free storage boxes to put the Bible in to store it.
Wow.
So it's being properly stored. It's in pretty rough shape, but we still have it.
Wow. So you're still in possession of the Bible.
Yeah, he's still in possession of it. Yes.
Okay, that's fantastic. So it's being preserved. Let me ask you, when I first found out about you and I started doing research, I thought it was so interesting that you are part of the Gullah Society. Can you tell me a little bit about the society and how you got involved?
Yeah. I got involved with the Gullah Society because a friend of mine was friends with Dr. O'Funyon. And he said, man, y'all got to get together. Because he had basically created the Gullah Society to protect black burial grounds.
Hmm.
And and I was doing this work on the other side. So I literally had, I mean, hundreds of cemeteries, a couple thousand cemeteries from around the state, and hundreds from around the county. And so we got together and my database became their database. And it was, we did several projects together. Unfortunately, he passed away unexpectedly and the Gullah Society was dissolved. But I did a lot of good years, and he was a good man.
I want to ask you about something specifically, and I didn't think about this until this very moment. One of the experiences that I had, and it was a very touching moment and a very emotional moment for me, is when I found a death certificate for my grandfather's father. My grandfather's father, Just James, from South Carolina, from the Petite region of South Carolina, had been born into slavery. Some different documents suggest that he was born somewhere between 1858 and 1860. And so his parents were definitely enslaved. And so I think about the fact that his death certificate states that he was buried in a potter's field.
Mhm.
And so that was a little heartbreaking for me because I know a good bit about my family's history and how hard they worked to establish, the places where they lived, including a community in Mars Bluff that's called Jamestown. Um,
Hard bluff.
yeah, so can you tell me a little bit about the Potter's Field? I know that there was a possibility of, both poor Black and white people, their burials in Potter's Field, but I want to talk specifically about Black people and how those burial sites were treated and are treated today.
But the a lot of people doesn't realize there's four types of burial grounds, roughly. And one is a public burial ground, which is a potter's field, indigent cemetery. People can't afford, especially when you had pandemics. When they had the smallpox outbreak and then the yellow fever outbreak here in Charleston, they were burying 100, 150 people a day in these things. And some of these cemeteries, like where Tower Hill Cemetery is, which is the Citadel, that whole area's got in excess of 28,000 graves in it. It's all been
Wow.
covered up.
So
You
where the
know,
Citadel is currently, their bodies under some of
well,
those,
not the Citadel itself, but the Citadel football stadium,
the stadium.
right? And
Mm,
Harmon Field across the street.
hmm.
That whole area, there was originally four cemeteries there. They eventually got congregated into one, but there's 28,000 burials is a hunk of change. That's a lot of burials. you
Hmm.
know, um, and then then you have private cemeteries, which are church cemeteries, business, private families, that type, enslaved cemeteries or benevolent societies. We had benevolent societies here, like the Brown Fellowship Society, which literally you got in if you were a certain shade of brown. They had a card that had shades of brown on it. If you were too dark, you couldn't join.
Okay, so was that paper bag test?
Correct. And
Okay.
then you'd have like where families could buy into the benevolent society. So when you died, you had a burial spot. Um, then you have your veteran cemeteries, and then you have your green cemeteries or your natural cemeteries. The veteran cemeteries, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, literally started because of the Civil War. When people died, hospital site, major battle, there would usually be a national cemetery pop up somewhere around it.
Hmm.
A lot of people, when you look at it, Arlington, a lot of people think Arlington been the first one. Arlington was like the seventh one built. Buford was
Hmm.
one of the first ones. Florence National was one of the first ones. So those are the four main types of cemeteries. With in pop Potter's fields or public burial grounds are not exactly the main thing now. They do have, you do still have indigent folks, people that come through, they don't know anything, nobody knows anything about them, they got to be buried somewhere. Now, what they do for the most part, especially in Charleston County, they'll keep these and they'll cremate them and then
Hmm.
put the ashes like in 55-gallon drum. And then they'll bury the drum when it gets full, or bury the stuff when it gets full, that type of
So
thing.
there's several people in the drum.
Yes.
Okay, okay,
I
okay.
mean, you're talking about an urn being like this, and you're
Right.
trying to fill a 55-gallon drum, you might have 1,000 people in that thing, a lot more.
Wow. Wow.
But that saves on space and money and that type thing.
Mhm. So I have two questions for, well, a comment and a question. The first comment is on something that you said. So um, I usually, when we talk about colorism, which is one of the things that we still have to talk about, that is a result of racism that has
Hmm.
come through the ideology of slavery. And so I am used to hearing about like social organizations and places that people would go, jazz clubs and things like that, that there was that paper brown test where you had to be a particular color. But this is new information to me, that to know that this was also prevalent in burial sites. So was that
Oh,
a
very much
common
so.
thing? So does it have anything to do also with social status and hierarchy, that
That's
the kind of
exactly what this one
affluence?
was. Because the
Okay.
darker you were, the more you were considered a field hand.
Mm-hmm.
Because you'd get dark and from the sun out in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier on, you had very dark complexion enslaved people came from Africa, and eventually, that got lightened up, through various means. But the darker you were, the more I guess ignorant you were considered. And they had
Mm-hmm.
it was a social club type thing that you had
Right.
to pay money into, and you had to be accepted into it and everything. And there's a lot of prominent um, African Americans from around the area, want free people of color, that type thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that cemetery to this day is a parking lot now for the College of Charleston Library.
Wow.
Yes,
Even after all that separation
all that
and
separation.
wow, and then now it's a parking lot, because it's so interesting, and it will always be interesting to me when I read and study about you know slavery during the transatlantic slave trade, how enslavers, particularly in South Carolina, how they felt about Black people who were newly enslaved from Africa, and treated them like they were thoroughbred horses.
Yes,
And so we know, and so they had a particular pride about that. And some of them refused to allow enslaved people from different countries to intermingle, because they felt that these people were quote unquote thoroughbreds. And we know that most African Americans, who take a DNA test today, they're going to be somewhere between maybe 10 and 20% European, because of assault of our foremothers. And
correct,
somehow that became a point of pride, that the skin was now lighter, like the enslaver's skin. And
correct.
so all of these, sort of organizations that were created as a result of that. And so to be able to, I think it's important to talk about it. Number one, I know it's one of the things that sometimes African Americans don't want to talk about, but it really is important, because it certainly has seeped into our society still today. It's one of the things that we talk about and have issues around. But it's interesting to be able to use the kind of genealogy research and documentation to see that these things were so prevalent in our society. Or was it shocking to you when you saw that, understanding sort of where all of this, colorism and classism, where it comes from?
Yes, Charleston was unique as in New Orleans. I literally have a photograph from New Orleans where enslaved children and free children of color would play with one another.
Mm-hmm.
So this one girl, she's dark, but not really dark. The other child was as white as I am. The white child was the enslaved one, and the black one was the free one,
Mm-hmm.
because the intermixing and everything. And New Orleans had terms like octoroon and decaroon, for the number of parts you're black. And you have different colors like high yellow, red bone, and you see
Mm-hmm.
all sorts of mulatto, anything like
Mm-hmm.
this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but Charleston was unique that, like the Harleston family, a Harleston family, just like Charleston without the C,
Mm-hmm.
they all derive from Old Man Harleston, who was a white plantation owner up in Berkeley County. And he never had a wife. He had a black mistress, and the children. And he had a eight, nine children, I think it was. All of them were black and white mixed. And when he died, they got his entire estate. They became multimillionaires, literally today's standard. They created Halston's funeral home from it. But even in that mix, you had the Harlestons you would see were part of the funeral home, but then you had the few Harleston who were just, mechanics and toolmen and just working street jobs, that type thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was speaking to an older black lady one time, and we were talking about the Harlestons, and she said, "Yeah, no, those Harlestons, those Harlestons from the funeral home, those uppity Negroes from Trad Street. Even then, they were the ones that better sister better than you type thing." And I was like, "Wow, Trad Street happened to be, pretty popular even to this day."
So blue collar and entrepreneurship and white collar jobs were often defined by colorism as well.
Correct.
Wow, wow. It's important to know. It really is important to know. So I want to talk with you about a couple of things that are happening today. And I know that you have done a lot of work in this in the past, but I want you to talk about and explain sort of what has happened in the past, what is happening. And I remember even talking with someone from Savannah who was having this issue where Black families have owned land, and a lot of times that land has become heir property
Heirs
after
property.
after someone has passed away, and it
Yes.
could be family land where they have had their own um, cemetery,
Hmm.
and so we're finding now a lot of usually wealthy white people or corporations are either buying the land or buying the land that surrounds that land. And I thought that South Carolina and some of the other states had laws around allowing access to
Yes, we
graveyards
do.
and
Hmm.
cemeteries. But we're finding literally that people are putting up fencing, even though they promised at the time of purchase they're going to honor whatever agreements are in place to allow Black families to go to these cemeteries and grave sites so they can always pay homage to their ancestors and visit these grave sites. But now we're seeing people put up fencing and doing all kinds of things to keep Black people off of the properties where these, grave sites and cemeteries are located. And I know this has gone on for a long time, but we're seeing it become very prevalent again. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. The main thing I tell people, families like that right there, is squeaky wheel gets the grease. If you have the law on your side,
Hmm.
you know, as long as you're abiding by it, first of all, the law in South Carolina is very antiquated, but it's very specific. When I say antiquated, when it was ratified back in the day, it basically says that you have to allow people to go to that burial ground, clean it up, visit their ancestors. They can continue to bury those cemeteries. You cannot stop
Hmm.
them by law. However, if you don't have, if it's locked up, you have to notify the landowner that you want to go on there. um, and there's back and forth with this, and that takes more than 30 days. So you have a burial, they're going to bury him down the street rather than here type thing. um, I'll be honest with you, out of all the cemeteries that I've dealt with on private land, I've only had two cemeteries that the guys were garbage. The second one not so much, but the first one, he lived up in New York. And he basically said, "Yeah, y'all can visit the cemetery, but you have to visit it in August. You have to park at the gate and walk back to the cemetery, which was 2 miles back in the woods."
Mm.
You know, and now
Yeah. So
of
if you,
course, you can go to court with that and say, "Hey, come on, judge. We got these elderly ladies and stuff like that." But most of the time,
yes.
people just say, "I ain't gonna bother with it," which is sad.
Wow.
But I find nowadays a lot more times you poke the bear, you can get bit, and the I find it more popular now, I guess you say now. When we had the Great Migration, where a lot of African American families went north to, New York, Pittsburgh, more jobs up north, you got the Jim Crow South. If that generation that's up there did not pass the cemetery information on to the next generation, you just lost that burial ground. You just
Wow.
lost that family history. And when a church dies in a neighborhood, the community dissolves. And if there's a cemetery attached to that church, so then what you're doing now is you come in here and find out that your ancestor is buried underneath the football stadium, that type thing.
Mm.
And it's when I've told people, I said, "Oh wow, yeah, this is where he's buried at, like this right here." I've literally see people just bawl and just cry because they had no idea,
Hmm.
and we're talking about grandparents, maybe great grandparents, not that many generations away.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Like I said, both of my great grandfathers had been born enslaved. And clearly, I'm not 100 years old yet, so it hasn't been that long ago. It
Mhm.
really hasn't been. But I hear you saying something very important, that it's really important to let younger generations know this information,
Correct.
because if they don't, we lose just really important parts of our family's history and
Right.
access, to, physical proof of our family's existence.
Yes, ma'am.
I do know that there are places in South Carolina, like Hilton Head, in Sapelo Island, in Georgia,
Sycamore, yeah.
and I think it's called not Beaufort, but Beaufort in North
North
Carolina,
Carolina.
where people are fighting for land that has been in their families forever. And in some situations where laws have been protecting them and they've been actively fighting, there have been rulings against these Black families that have owned this land for generations. What do you, or how do you see that or explain how that is happening?
Well, they have I can't remember the name. I think they changed the name, but there's actually a group of people that work with people on heirs property here in
Hmm.
Charleston. They're
Hmm.
well versed in that, and they're very good at what they do. Heirs property is an interesting thing because lots of times there's no deed or anything associated with the property. It was just passed down, especially after emancipation, when during Reconstruction, when there was not a lot of money. Lots of times they would, sell pieces of property off. But you could
Hmm.
look in the Charleston GIS record, and you could see where these guys thought they were fooling the African American folks, and they would sell this strip of property, might be 400 or 500 yards, maybe longer deep, but only 50 yards across, in these long strips of property. But they would buy a few together, and they would all merge them together. But if there's no deed with it, you know what it is. It goes by somebody's paying the tax for it, but then on the heirs property document, it has the people listed by most senior child or most senior person at a higher percentage. It goes all the way down to the farthest away to the smallest percentage.
Hmm.
And even though you might have the person here that was paying the taxes, anybody in that list right there can sell a part of their property, that percentage of that property, whenever they want to. Don't have to tell anybody else.
Right. And
You
there's usually
know,
always someone in every family who will do that.
especially ones that have been lived up north out of this area, whatever, they have no
Hmm.
connection to it, and it makes it an easy buck. You know, the
Hmm. Hmm.
one of the things that happened not too long ago is it was down in Beaufort where this subdivision or developers are trying to run this older African American lady out of her property,
Hmm.
and I want to say it was Tyler Perry got involved
Yes.
and built her a new house and everything like that. And sadly, she passed away not too soon after that. But
Hmm.
they saved the property.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
happened on Defusky Island as well. A
Hmm.
while, several 20, 30, 40 years ago now, where they tried to build a all-inclusive golf course residential place, and it all fell through. And people are Mount Pleasant. There was a court case that came from Mount Pleasant where these people had bought this property that encompassed the Rimley's Point Cemetery or the Scanlonville Cemetery. Scanlonville is the name of the Freedmen's Village that was there. Rimley's Point
Hmm.
is the name of the part for the river. And
Hmm.
in the law, you have to notify 30 days, every day in the newspaper, 30 days in advance that you're going to be doing this. And if anyone wants to complain or have any concerns about it, family wise, has to come in. Now, if you don't have a newspaper, this is what I'm talking about antiquated. If you don't have a newspaper, you're supposed to nail it to the courthouse door. That's with the law
Does that
readers.
still happen?
Yeah, no, 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 no. It's just
Okay.
um, but the I'd like to see that. They say you're destroying property, so this is what it says in the law. Nail it on the
Hmm.
door.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but the families revolted at Ridley's Point, and the people ended up spending a lot of money on the property in the end, they were not able to build their house, and ended up donating to the civic society, civic association there, and I guess wrote it off on taxes. They set a precedence because their point was, well, it's old and overgrown, and nobody's buried here anymore. When in fact they had three current burials that just happened in here. And the
Mm-hmm.
court case basically set a precedence that lots of times these African American cemeteries or previously enslaved cemeteries, they let them grow back to nature, but they'll still use it, which opened up the floodgates on anything that was overgrown, that type thing.
Okay. So you're saying continuing to use the burial sites, it's helpful in terms of maintaining them?
Yeah, you have a lot of times, let's say we have very tight communities here. Um, and for instance, at Hamilton Plantation, up on I think it's French CT Road up in Santee, um, Hampton Plantation, Hampton, excuse me.
Hmm.
As you go in, there's a black cemetery off to the left. It was originally an enslaved cemetery from the 1700s. They still burying that thing to this day. So you
Oh,
have the
wow.
descendants of the descendants of the descendants of the descendants of the descendants are still being buried in this thing to this day.
Hmm.
But it's all kept nice and clean. But you'll have another one that like last burial been in 1950, and then it's all overgrown now. Nobody else is being buried in there, and then it gets into private property. It might be indicated on some older plats, but when the newer plats come around, it's conveniently left off. Then you have somebody with one of the cases I was dealing with, and this is the other guy I was talking about. He came from up north, bought this plantation, and then we came to and made it known that there's a cemetery on this property, and there's no cemetery on the plat. And we literally had to show, and I ended up using LiDAR mapping to show exactly where the cemetery is at. He said, here's a perfect square right here. There's no right angles in nature. It's right here. And we went out there, and sure enough, there's what's left of this old cemetery. Most of the time, if it's previously enslaved, and I use the term enslaved rather than slave. Previously enslaved, you might just have a field rock as a gravestone.
Right, right,
In
right.
town in Charleston, there's several gravestones that have like one name on it,
Hmm.
or faithful servant. Up in Brook Green Gardens, they have one that's it's a very ornate stone, and it's got a guy laying on a bed with a bolt of lightning hitting him. It said on the thing, it said, "To my faithful servant, blah blah blah, struck down by lightning on this date,"
Oh, wow.
and
And
that's
so
his
they have
gravestone
so they have that carved into the
in the
gravestone?
gravestone. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, wow. I'm gonna switch over a little bit because I want to talk about this. Our time's running out, but I do want to definitely talk about this. So I was able to find out a lot of information about my grandfather, who had served in the military because of a burial record.
Right.
So my mother had always told me, my mother was one of 12. She was either like 10 or 11. She was a twin. So either 10 or 11. So she was one of the younger children in the family. So she didn't know a whole lot about it, but she'd heard that he had served in the World War. My grandfather was born in the 1890s. And so when I finally found his death certificate a few years ago, I saw that they had petitioned for a headstone, the funeral home director,
Mhm.
and my grandfather had served in World War One. And so that was certainly a point of pride for me, to know that he had served, and was then able to find, records where he had been on the USS Leviathan, and had gone to France on several occasions. So can
Right.
you tell me about a little bit about African Americans in military service and how those records can be helpful in finding more information about our families?
Well, let's talk about World War One. A majority of your black troops were cooks, dug latrines, service companies, that type thing. You did have some that fought, like the 369th, 370, 371st Infantry Regiments in the 93rd Infantry Division.
Hmm.
That's Harlem Hellfighters, the Red Hands. Um, but like the 371st, General Blackjack Pershing, who is the main head of the troops there in the American Expeditionary Forces in France, basically he wasn't very fond of black troops. And they gave the 371st to the French army.
Wow.
So they fought under the French banner. But in fact, they used French equipment. They had the old blue helmets that the French used to wear. That's part of their battle flag, the blue helmet. Um, the 369th, the Harlem Hellfighters. The Harlem Hellfighters, they were the Germans called black soldiers the Black Devils because you
Mhm.
kill one, 10 more would take his place. They would never go away. They just kept, well, 371st was infantry regiment. One of the main battles was at Cote 188, which was Hill 188. And the Germans had set a trap for them, making it look like they were retreating. So these guys had gone forward and they basically just obliterated them, just ambushed them. And one of the soldiers, and for some reason his name skips my mind right now, Freddie Stower, he all his white commanders and officers were killed. So he was a corporal, I think he was. He took over and they attacked these machine gun nests. He was like pistols and hand grenades and that type thing.
Mhm.
And in the end, all these Germans lay dead, and whatever was left of his crew was there. And they all looked back, and he had been just annihilated, and he basically bled to death. Um, he was immediately put in for the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Mhm.
And Blackjack Pershing said, no, it's going to upset too many white soldiers. We'll give them the Silver Star. Now, later on in the early 90s, when they started reviewing a lot of these things, he did receive the Medal of Honor, but however, he had passed away and it was posthumously given to two of his sisters, I think, who were still alive.
I remember. I
Yeah.
remember. I remember reading about that.
And I think that was one of two soldiers, two black soldiers in the World War One that received Medal of Honor.
Hmm.
Um, the Civil War, United States Color Troops. That's one of my specialties. I love the United States Color Troops. Um, there was 166 regiments, 180,000 plus soldiers, a tenth of the Union Army, basically. Um, and they fought in a lot of the battles. But then as you look at these battles, they were a lot of the ones that were leading the battle off, testing the waters, per
Okay.
se.
Let's talk about that. That's really important. Um, because again, this is history. This is sort of that hidden history that I and most people who are my age and maybe even younger were never taught. We
No.
were never taught this history, and it's so important. So when you said that they were leading in battle, talk about that a little bit, how these black bodies were
And
used in battle.
I don't remember the exact regiment numbers, the numbers for them, but at the Battle of Chaffin's Farm, Newmarket Heights, Virginia. The morning of that battle, they had three regiments lead off the battle, colored regiments. And within 45 minutes to an hour or so, one of the regiments had a loss of like 90%. At that one battle, and it was a running battle, it happened in different places. There were 14 Congressional Medal of Honor recipients that were United States Color Troops. Out of the 18 that were Army, and there was 8 Navy. Out of the 18 that were given to the Army, 14 came from that one battle, that one day. It was you don't listen to this kind of stuff. You don't hear this kind of stuff. This
Right.
I had a very, pardon the pun, whitewash history whenever I was in elementary school,
Hmm.
and they spoke briefly about Denmark Vesey, and I had actually found a transcribed copy of the actual Denmark Vesey trials. And then I started reading that, and I started getting angry. Like I said, that no, no, what? There was an accusation. It never even occurred. It was just an accusation.
Hmm.
And I said, hold up, wait a minute. That's not what they taught me in my history class. They just basically brushed it over, that type thing.
Absolutely.
I was like, if you want to know, because history is definitely written by the victors. So if you really, really want to know something that's going on, especially if it's something like, Black history during the Civil War and that type of thing, there's a lot of books. There's the entire 60 something volume set of books that were written of all the Confederate and Union reports
Hmm.
throughout the entire war, listing all the different battles and different things, losses and that kind of thing. Um, Especially if you read about the second assault on Fort Wagner with the 54th, it's literally harrowing to read. It is absolutely, and of course, you're talking about people that are military, so there are acceptable deaths in military, and just the casualness they use to talk about this thing, and knowing these guys suffered, and the ones that were dead, they threw them in a big pit in the ground on the beach. And that very pit they put on the beach is the reason why the Confederates had to evacuate, because the dead bodies started affecting their groundwater, their drinking water.
Wow. Wow.
You
Well, it's so interesting. And two things I want to share, particularly, with my grandfather. Again, it wasn't something that was really talked about in my family. And as you were saying, when you were in school, it was whitewashed. When I was in school in South Carolina, this kind of information was non-existent. Even growing up and seeing veterans parades, there were no Black men celebrated or women in
know,
veterans parades, when I was growing up in South Carolina. So one of the things I learned about my grandfather, he had been a pipe fitter with the railroad. And
right,
so that was the skill that he actually took to the military. And so when
right.
I find him on this boat, this USS Leviathan, which was a transport ship, there are pictures of of troops with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But there are no Black faces in those pictures because they were not allowed to be in pictures because it would incite a sense of pride to their families back home. So they were not allowed to be in those pictures. The other thing is, as I'm learning about military service, particularly during World Wars One and Two, but in World War One, how with my grandfather and others who were in France, how happy the French people were to see them and how much better they treated them than they were treated back in America.
Yes, that is
Um,
very, very prolific. Um, Especially with like the 371st.
mhm,
The French version of the Congressional Medal of Honor is the Croix de Guerre. Okay.
mhm,
The entire 371st Regiment, every single member received the Croix de Guerre. It's like, and their sense of racism there was nowhere near what it was over here at the time.
mhm,
And they had Black pilots. I think it was a Canadian boxer, was a and or I can't remember exactly where he was from, but he went there and he was an ace. He, fought the Red Baron and different things like that. And he was a black boxer that lived out his life in France. And it was just a different time.
It was a different thing, even so much so that white prisoners of war could ride in the front of transport trains, but Black military soldiers still had to be in the back of American transport trains. Like
And
that is
if they have enough regular cars, they rode in the cargo cars.
rode in the cargo car, but and yet they were fighting for the country,
Yep.
which for me is amazing. And it speaks to me about um, how our families coming, again, my grandfather was just one generation out of slavery. How they were willing to sacrifice and to die and to fight for this country. And then, when he came back to, when he was done with the war and came back to his family, had to live through Jim Crow.
Yes. There was one of the things we did with the Gullah Society is we had a art exhibit called Rattling Bones. And basically my job was to talk about and do a graphic on the locations where reported lynchings took place at in South Carolina.
Mhm.
The only one to occur, or one of two to occur in Charleston over this whole period of time, was they called it Bloody Sunday, and I cannot remember the date, but it was World War One soldiers had been provoked by Navy seamen from the Navy base, white Navy seamen, and they had this massive riot. And there were several soldiers that were killed. These were World War One soldiers that were not receiving recognition for what they did. And these guys basically were, messing with them. And it's just that's what had happened, and it just blew up that quick. And nothing ever really happened to the Navy soldiers, my understanding, Navy sailors. Nothing like life in prison or anything like this. You know, and that is just, it's the same story just repeated everywhere.
This is true. This is true. As a matter of fact, what we do know is that one of the biggest reasons after emancipation that Black men would be lynched could be because they wore their military uniforms.
Right,
And I have spoken to George Frierson, who is a community researcher and historian in Clarendon County, and he shared his own experiences about how he, was warned by, his captain, his superiors on the base, that when he was to travel from Fayetteville, North Carolina, back to Clarendon County, that he probably should not wear his uniform because it could be one of those things that could cost him his life because he had actually served the country and had the audacity to wear his uniform. I want to, and I know, again, your time is so precious and I don't want to take up too
oh
much of
no,
your
take your time,
time.
you're good.
I want to just ask you a couple of things, and I want to, before we end the conversation today, to talk about some of the genealogy research that you're able to do for others and how people are going to be able to contact you. But I want to ask you, just in terms of offering advice to people who are just starting out on this journey, and they may have bits and pieces of oral history, and they may have, obituaries, and then maybe they're connected to a family church that, their family has been a part of for a few generations. What are
Right.
some of the things that you can suggest to them in terms of how to get started and what they can do?
Rule number one, family lore does not exactly mean the truth. If I had a dime for every time somebody said, we've got Cherokee in our blood, that type thing, I would own Zoom. I mean, it's, but that's no fault of their own. They're only repeating what they've been told, that type
Mhm,
thing. Um, even with death certificates and stuff that's reported to coroner, it's only as good as the information that came from the person reporting it. So, I mean, I've literally had a guy that the death certificate was 30 years off from his actual birth date because he was 90 something years old when he died, but he looked younger, and there were like great grandchildren still left. They didn't know exactly when he was born, so they said, "Oh, he looks like this right here." They were 30 years off on his gravestone when he was born, and it's you just have to look at that. Another thing is if you're looking at the census record, 1900 census has Granddaddy Bob Sr. and Granddaddy Bob Jr. Granddaddy Bob Jr. is 2 years old in 1900, born 1898. 1910 census rolls around. Granddaddy Bob Jr. now is born in 1905. Well, what happened? The first one passed away. They recycled the name to the next child. So if you
mhm,
don't look at that, that could really throw a wrench in the gears. Or the repeat names for the generations, like especially biblical names, Hezekiah, Meshach, Abednego. All these names have been used, but for just purpose of saying this, like Tom, Dick, and Harry, they each had three sons, and they named them Tom, Dick, and Harry.
mhm,
And then but their fathers and uncles were Tom, Dick, and Harry. And it's like, and if you get a couple 20, 30 years there together with that, you have literally three generations of Tom, Dick, and Harry's that if the dates are a little bit off, it's messed up.
mhm, mhm,
Um, the if your family was in the 1870 census, but they were not in the 1860 census, there's a very good chance they were enslaved
mhm.
because they did not put enslaved names in the census record. They put free people of color's name in the census record. Anything prior to 1865 Sometimes you'd have to look at the families as their property because they had to pay tax on their property.
So you're talking about like looking at wills and deeds and records like that, where you may not be able to find someone in
Tax lists,
1850. Mm-hmm,
tax
mm-hmm,
lists.
mm-hmm,
One series, I think here in South Carolina, has them listed by single names.
mm-hmm.
The next one came around by single names, but by household.
Okay.
You know, um, wills, that type thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think at one time of the top 10 um, people that owned the most enslaved people, the top 5 or 6 were from South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those happened to be a black man that
Mm-hmm.
owned his own kind.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the if Lots of times you'll see too that the husband, he might die at age 25 or 30, 35. You can imagine the stress he's been under, that type of thing. But the wife outlived him by 60 something years and never remarry,
Yes.
that type thing. And what you'll find out is lots of times they're not buried in the same cemetery. There's so much time passed by, they'll bury in another cemetery, that type thing.
Mhm.
Just because you
Okay.
see the man buried here doesn't necessarily mean the wife's buried there, and vice versa.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and that's what I would put. There's a good chance he's buried here, but I cannot guarantee you 100% that he's buried here.
Okay. Okay. In the same place. Right.
Right.
Okay. And
Um,
then how can you tell me how, if someone is interested in having you do some research for them, whether it is for family history and genealogy, or if someone is working on a project, which I know that there are a lot of them going around the country right now where people are needing advisors, they're trying to restore historic cemeteries. How can someone
they
reach you?
can email me at ggmishoe. That's Mishoe. My first 2 initials, ggmishoe at gmail.com.
Any last thoughts that you want to share with us or give to any kind of encouragement to people who are just starting on this search?
Yes, definitely slow and steady. You might get it wrong, but then you realize you got it wrong, you go back and fix it. Lots of this time, it's just like 2 records on the thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And, I always tell people to have a buddy because you might be in this thing for 10 hours and not see it. They might be 5 minutes. Oh, there it is right there. And you're pulling your hair out because you didn't, that type of thing. And the more you get tired, take a rest, drink some coffee. But slow and steady, wins the race.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's good. That's a good note to end on because again, it is a lot of work. It does require a lot of hours. But again, and the ancestors will be found when they are ready to be found. So
Correct.
you have to continue to search. Listen, you have been an amazing guest,
Thank you.
which is no surprise. But thank you again for taking time out to talk with me and to, talk with my listeners and viewers. And just thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.